Joining me now, the author of Blood Money, Secret Empires, and many more, host of Drilldown podcast, author, investigative journalist, Peter Schweizer. Peter, great to have you here. I hope you had a great Christmas, and hopefully we'll all have a better 2025.
Yeah, I think we're going to. I think we're going to have a great 2025. And thank you. Had a great Christmas, and I hope you had the same.
Well, no, we had a great time with the family. It was awesome. New Year's is always a little rough. My birthday is New Year's Eve, so tomorrow's my birthday. I get older. When I was a kid, New Year's Eve was a lot better because it was like there's always something to do. There's always a party. There's always something. I just lost my FB. There's always something, but now it's sort of like amateur night, and I realized that, and so I get to be around 1,000 drunk people giving me their political opinions that I don't necessarily want to hear. While I love Mar-a-Lago, it's sort of like by about midnight when everyone's like 12 beers deep or whatever it is they're drinking, the close talking opinions. It's not for me. I'm you wouldn't know it, but I'm basically a recluse. I'm okay with a mic when I have a big crowd, but I don't like being around a lot of people if I can avoid it. I like fishing, hunting, and like two people. So it's but
that's awesome. Yeah, and I imagine being at Mar-a-Lago is a little bit like being at Woodstock, and you're in a band or you're a singer and everybody's giving you musical advice, and you're like, I'm good. I'm on the stage.
This will be like year 9 of, hey, have you ever thought to maybe have your dad not tweet that? Or I'm like, no, I've never thought that because I'm a freaking imbecile. Like I've never thought, wow, you are an incredible political mind. That's less of a problem lately, but this was the first few years of, political commentary. Tomorrow, why don't you just do this? Or, so yeah, I don't know. Love it and hate it at the same time. So, it'll be fun. And, again, now that I'll be 47, approaching that number of 50, it's sort of like, it's harder every year. I enjoy celebrating that much less every time.
Yep. No, I get it. I think we can all relate to that. And I just turned 60, so that was kind of a seminal, year. And this is the first birthday that really got to me. So you got that to look forward to, but it's still 13 years away. So not too close.
I got 50 first. I figured that would be that's sort of a rough one when you think, because I don't feel old at all. Like I hang out with mostly younger people. Like I don't feel like I'm almost 50, but I'm legit almost 50, which is ridiculous. It's anyway, I guess 50 is the new 30 or something like that. Whatever I have to tell myself to sleep better at night, I guess.
Yeah. Whatever you can do, man. You can always hope. You can always hope the 50 is the new 30.
Exactly. So far I've been hoping that sort of medical technology, advances faster than my early onset arthritis from a misspent youth, and that has not actually worked out in my favor yet. So you never know. There's always a chance.
Absolutely. No, I'm 60 and I feel great. And, part of it is just who you have in your life, what's going on in your life. You love what you do. That's what keeps you young. And that's been my experience with everybody. I know guys that are in their 90s that are still active and interested in things. And so that I think is the key. And I've met 35-year-olds that seem really, really, really old because they don't love what they do. They don't believe in anything.
100%.
That's really what keeps you young.
I think that's right. I mean, that'll be an interesting thing now. I mean, maybe that's a place to start. But even for me, like cycling off a campaign, like as brutal as it is, as crazy as it is, as 24-hour days, all-nighters. There's something about the action. You're there talking to people. It's like when you cycle off of that, there's actually like a dopamine dearth. That goes away. That I after January 20th, I'll probably be like, I hated everything for the last 6 months. It's been brutal, but now I kind of miss it because you sort of like the action, and the action keeps you young.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's action. And it's combat, in a way. I mean, it's
correct.
Combat, not obviously real combat.
Yes, we don't need to create the stolen valor memes right now.
Yeah, exactly. So not suggesting that, but it's not just that you're engaged in an adventure. You're engaged in an adventure where you are facing opposition, headwinds. And in the case of 2024, it's not just an opposing campaign. It's the media establishment. It's corporate America. It's all of those entities. And so Yeah, I can imagine the adrenaline push and the dopamine push is absolutely real and it's invigorating.
Yeah.
And then when it's gone, yeah, you're kind of looking around saying, man, it's really quiet here. How did it get quiet so fast?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, maybe that's where we start. I mean, you know, the dopamine rush, you'd think being president of the United States would give you the dopamine rush. What happens to Joe Biden after January 20th? Because if he's riding the dopamine high, what's it like for him when he's not? And when you kind of compare, you know, my father's a couple of years younger, but, you know, my dad's 78 and he's pulling all-nighters and going, you know, Joe Biden can't make it to, make it to lunch without, you know, taking a nap. You know, maybe that is like a perfect example of like age is just a number depending on the person.
Yeah, no, well, I think it is. And again, I know people that are in their 90s, their mid 90s, they're alert, they're mentally fit, certainly more capable of making decisions and showing more stamina than Joe Biden does. You know, it's interesting to me. I mean, I have this theory. I don't have proof or evidence for it, but it would fit the pattern. And that is that during that period when Joe Biden had that, you know, that first debate performance, which was absolutely disastrous, and the time from that debate to when he actually pulled out and dropped out and Kamala Harris took his place, you know, there was a 7 to 8 week period there. And what happened? Hunter Biden effectively moved into the White House. Yeah. And my theory is that you had all this pressure from big Democratic donors, from people like Nancy Pelosi and other elected officials. They wanted him out. And my theory is, in typical Joe Biden fashion and Biden family fashion, they negotiated a golden parachute or an exit strategy, an exit payment strategy. What form that takes, I don't know, but I'm sure there are a lot of people in Hollywood, a lot of people tied up in the Democratic Party establishment that were prepared to throw millions of dollars at the Biden family under, you know, consulting arrangements or whatever to get him to go away. So I think that probably happened. So I think it's not going to require a lot of work on his part. They got money coming in. But this is a guy whose entire adult life has been identified and wrapped up in political office. He's never done anything else. And I don't know what you do after that. Even if you've got limited cognitive ability, you still know you no longer have political power. So it's going to be a huge, huge adjustment for him.
Yeah, I mean, and talk about that a little bit, right? I mean, we all knew he was sort of, you know, let's call it brain dead for the last couple of years. He was still able to, you know, stay there. It took that debate for everyone to realize. And, you know, you're now, I'm sort of looking forward to the postmortems. I'm sure you'll be all over this, but, you know, when everyone starts writing the tell-all books about just how bad it was, you know, I think the Democrats would usually be pretty good about hiding that kind of stuff, certainly much better than our side ever would. But I imagine now that, you know, that dynasty is clearly over. You know, there's a lot of clickbait that's going to happen with all of this. How bad do you think that's going to be? And do you think it's actually worse than we saw, even if what we saw was atrocious?
Yeah, I think it's going to be worse than we thought. And here's the thing. I think it's going to get pretty ugly because I'm not sure that the center of gravity in the Democratic Party realized what happened in this last election. They're still sort of making excuses that it's something else. You know, it was messaging rather than the substance of what they did, or it was, you know, certain tactical decisions they made. The fact of the matter is they lost terribly, and they lost bad on substance. Real substance. But I think they haven't gotten that message yet. So they're going to continue to look for excuses. And one of those excuses is going to be Joe Biden let us down. He clung to power for too long. He shouldn't have done that disastrous debate. He should have left earlier in the year. That would have given Kamala more time, or maybe we could have had a,
to do what though? Like more time to do what? Like, I mean, she got on The View and basically committed political suicide on The View. Like, you know, she was asked, you know, 3 or 4 basic questions, flubbed them horribly the first time, was given chance after, I don't want to say a lot of chances, only because she barely did any media or any press that wasn't sort of teleprompted and scripted stuff. But if she can't answer those things after having a disaster and still can't answer them the next time, let alone 5 or 6 times later, you know, was there ever going to be a change?
No, bingo. And I think what you're saying absolutely proves the point that I'm trying to make, which is these are all excuses they're trying to manufacture. They don't want to look at the fundamental issue, which is the center of gravity of the Democratic Party is too progressive. They have terrible policies, and they were rejected by the American people because you had a Republican candidate who came forward and had a more appealing message, and it was a substantive message. Mm-hmm. They don't want to confront that, but because to confront that for some of them is the equivalent of kind of having a religious view and realizing that religious view does not conform at all to reality.
Yeah, leftism is their religion, and so you're right. They don't believe in a deity or a god. They that is their religion, and so it's interesting. Do you think there's anything to this whole notion? Joe Biden out there apparently complaining to his aides that he would have done better than Kamala Harris. I mean, listen, there could be something to it. I mean, there's sort of this component of like Kamala Harris is like she made Hillary Clinton seem likable once you got to know her a little bit. And I'm not saying anyone liked the policies, and it was a lack of substance. And I don't actually believe that Joe Biden, thinks that gender affirming care for 3-year-olds is the socio-political, issue of our day or whatever it is that the Democrat Party said. But do you think that Joe Biden could have actually done better than her?
It's possible. Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy thing to say, but it's possible.
It's hard to hate. It's sort of like hating a dumb dog. Like it's like, okay, you put up with it. You don't vehemently dislike it. You don't have a visceral reaction to it, like I think a lot of people had towards Kamala Harris. So maybe there's some truth to that. As shocking as that may be, given his overall level of competence.
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, Kamala Harris takes herself more seriously than Joe Biden does. I'm not saying that Joe Biden doesn't take himself seriously, but Kamala Harris, there's this like earnestness that if you reject me, you are rejecting all that is good and virtuous in America. And, you may be a misogynist or racist or whatever else to go along with it. With Joe Biden, there is kind of, because he's been in retail politics so long, there is slightly a sense. So in that respect, maybe he was more appealing. Also, I think it was kind of a debate. People were looking at Kamala Harris and they're saying, this is not a steady hand. She's not confident. She's not really competent. She hasn't demonstrated anything. And you contrast that with Joe Biden, where, okay, you don't agree with him. He'd been in the arena for a long time and he has diminished capabilities, but he still might have been a more trusted hand.
No, the fact that we're even having this conversation of like which ones, like it's right. Like, the leader of the free world can have dementia and it's still better possibly than the Democrats, front runner, as well as, according to the polls, they're front runner for 2028, which I hope actually continues to be Kamala Harris.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I do think it's going to be interesting in 2028. I do think the Democrats are going to try to, at least some of them, are going to try to bring back the sort of Clinton brand, the so-called triangulation, or the more supposedly centrist version. So I think there's going to be a faction that's going to get behind like Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, but you still have the Gavin Newsom, the California left wing of the party, which I think is ascendant. So they may make that effort, but it's going to be really hard for them to go with a more centrist candidate just because of where the base of primary voters are for Democrats today.
Well, and where the money is, right? The money in the Democrat Party is being funded by the most radical people of that party. There's a reason we won so much of that blue collar vote. I mean, the radicals still really believe that these, the hills to die on for them are not things that resonate with the American public at all. And yet, these are their priorities. And, you don't get that money if you don't buy into that, sort of ethos.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it's big tech. It's Hollywood and a certain, function of people that are trust fund kids, right? Their parents made a bunch of money and they're now, liberal Democrats. That is the center of gravity of the finance for the Democratic Party. And that is not going to change. They're just going to have to decide whether they are prepared to reduce their religious affection for progressive causes in the hope they have a better chance of winning. That's the balancing choice they have to make. What's interesting about the Republican Party is you don't really have that debate. You don't really have that debate because the center of gravity of the party is now the sort of Trump MAGA movement. That is the center of gravity of the party, and there's no reason to try to triangulate or do something different. And that's what I think is so extraordinary about this time, because coalitions for the Republican Party are far less important than the Democrats trying to, form coalitions with elements on Wall Street or, people in the Midwest or wherever, because they can't be true to what they actually believe because it's too radical.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk, though, a little bit further about Joe Biden. You've obviously, you've written entire books about sort of the corruption in not just the Democrat Party, but in the Biden crime family. And now, after years of guys like you and, to a lesser extent me, but I wrote a book triggered about, just these kinds of things. Biden is literally seen in newly uncovered photos meeting with Hunter Biden's Chinese business associates while he was vice president. I mean, how is it possible that someone, the second most powerful man in the world, can cover that up for that long? Again, guys like you, guys like me, we know about it, we talk about it. It never really broke through the ether to the mainstream, and certainly not with the media. But how is it possible that we're just getting this now? Like every good conspiracy theory, it's proven correct usually a couple months later, in this case, a couple of years later. And what does it ultimately mean that, clearly many people knew about this? It was well documented, and yet the American public never actually got to see that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a small example of the deep state at work. People use the term deep state all the time, and people ask me, well, what does it mean? This is an example of it. The question here was a request for photos was made through the Freedom of Information Act to the National Archives. Okay, we're not talking about the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. We're talking about the National Archives, which should not be a politically engaged government agency.
But it is. That's the same agency that went after Trump for, taking personal letters home. So.
Exactly. My point is, you wouldn't think it was, but it is. And it shows the penetration of the deep state and how even something like an archives agency has been weaponized. And what they did in the case of those letters is they weaponized the archives office. In this case, they dragged their feet for years about these photos, when the photos were not hard to find. They were part of an official vice presidential visit on Air Force 2 to China. I had reported in 2018, you talked about it in your book, that Hunter flew with his dad on Air Force 2 to China, that Hunter met with his Chinese partners, and Joe Biden insisted for years that, he might have been there. His son might have been there. He might have met with his business partners, but Joe Biden himself, never actually met with Hunter's business partners, which just, strained credulity beyond the breaking point. But the media clung to it. And now, of course, the photos show what I'd reported, what you'd reported, what others have covered, is that, in fact, they did meet. And this was the main reason that Hunter Biden was actually able to get business deals, to get Chinese, businessmen to send him millions of dollars when he brought nothing to the table. It was because his dad was vice president and was slated to eventually become president of the United States in the eyes of Democrats. So it to me, the photos are important. It confirms something we already knew. So that's, not a huge thing. It feels good. But the larger issue, it's a further example of what has happened to our federal bureaucracy, even in these sleepy corners of the archives departments. It's being used to prevent the American people from getting access to legitimate information. We know if this had been a photo involving Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush or somebody else, they would have dropped these photos right away. So that's the larger vision. And it goes to, I think, what we should look forward to in 2025, which is going to be real trench warfare of cleaning out government agencies and getting government to function the way that it's supposed to function, which is serving the American people and being transparent, not these hidden games to protect certain political figures.
Yeah, so, you've uncovered so much of this story already. You've been talking about it. You've written literally entire books on the subject. But Biden's now leaving office. Hunter gets a blanket pardon, going way back into Joe Biden's vice presidency, not even just, the time around the last few years. So what does it all mean for where this story goes or how it ends? Is it just forgotten? Do we get to the bottom of it so that at least the American public has a final understanding. Now that he gets a pardon, does a Republican Congress call him up to talk about all of these things? I mean, the pardon, I mean, most of the stuff they let wash away anyway, right? We all understand that the stuff that was actually serious, the FARA violations, the millions of dollars from foreign entities, was sort of hidden under the guise of, a gun charge. And the gun charge is real. I have a feeling I'd be prosecuted for the gun charge without question, but they wouldn't let the statute of limitations expire on everything else. Do we get this information now just so that, again, the American public gets the transparency it deserves to how broken our system actually is?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think Jim Comer's done a great job at the House Oversight Committee. He's got subpoena power. He ought to have Hunter Biden come and testify. He doesn't need to invoke the Fifth Amendment anymore because he can't be charged on any of these issues. Yeah. So, yeah, I think Congress needs to pursue it because, as I've talked about, we talked about this before, Don, this is a story about Joe Biden, but it's a bigger story than that. Because what you find with people that are creatures of Washington that stay there for decades, they look around and they see, okay, the Clintons got away with this stuff. Yeah. The Bidens got away with this stuff. Maybe I should do it. Maybe my family should do it. So you've got to lay down the marker. It's not about fighting some past war involving Joe Biden. It's about laying down the predicate of this is how things should be done in Washington by our leaders. Here's the other thing I would say about this pardon, Don. I mentioned earlier about, did the Biden family negotiate an exit deal for Joe Biden to get out of the White House? Look at the wording on that pardon. It has specific dates. It runs from January of 2014, which, by the way, that is right before the Ukrainian deals start. That's right as the Chinese deals are signed. So it's clearly designed to cover those deals at the front end. But it goes from January of 2014 to December 1st of this year. Why do they feel the need to cover 2024? I think it's because, again, I don't have evidence for this, but I think it is because there were deals cut for the family so that Joe Biden would step aside. And this is a way of protecting them because let's remember Rod Blagojevich went to jail on charges, allegations that he got something in return for arranging for somebody to clearing the way for somebody to be a candidate for office, to appoint them to the U.S. Senate. There is the possibility that there may have been deals made that brushed up against or were even illegal for Joe Biden to step out of the office. And I think the pardon is designed to cover those as well. Because what else is Hunter Biden doing in 2014 that would warrant this kind of blanket pardon up until December of this year?
Yeah, and what happens with that, right? Fine. The pardons are what the pardons are. I understand the purpose. Do they get to keep the ill-gotten gains if there are some? I mean, do they, it's one thing to say, hey, I can't be charged criminally, but, I made hundreds of millions of dollars lying to the American people, committing crimes, leveraging, the office of the vice presidency when he was there. Do they just get to keep that, or can there be some sort of, a clawback provision on those ill-gotten gains if they're done illegally? I get that he's not going to jail for it, but does he just get to keep the money? Can you steal a couple $1 billion or hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever it may be? And it's like, all gone. You can't actually touch it because you can't do this stuff criminally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so maybe there's a way to claw it back. I don't know. But from the standpoint of how they made the money, and you're now saying with these blanket pardons, you cannot be criminally charged for the $31 million that we know of that they got from the Chinese.
I guarantee you it's a lot more. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
That's China. You're right. That's just China. Then you had Ukraine. Then you had Russia. Then clearly laundering money for Russian oligarchs. You don't become the money manager of the wife of the mayor of Moscow. I mean that's true Russia collusion, right? Let's just be clear. Yeah. You don't become the mayor of Moscow without Putin's direct knowledge and say so, right? That's how this works. Yeah. Like we can't be naive about that. And if it was me, I have a feeling it would be treated and handled differently.
Oh, well, 100% it would. And let's remember, by the way, that Yelena Baturina, who is the wife of the mayor that you're talking about, we know of at least $3.5 million, probably more, but at least $3.5 million that we saw the wire transfer for. She wired to Hunter Biden in 2014, when the Biden-Obama administration was deciding who of Putin's oligarch buddies were going to be restricted from doing business in the United States. And she's basically the only pro-Putin oligarch that was not on that list. Yeah. So there were clear quid pro quos.
I'm sure that's a coincidence, right, Peter?
Yeah, exactly. I don't believe in those coincidences. So, but to your point, yeah, I mean, that is the problem here, and why we need to get to the bottom of this, and why I think we need to look at legal recourse. We need to look at public accountability, because again, there's a lot of shameless people in Washington, D.C. that if they can get away with this stuff, they're going to do it. And I think one of the reasons the Bidens got into this business of what I call globalized corruption, right? You're not taking payments from some businessman back in your congressional district. You're taking money from foreign governments. The Bidens learned it from the Clintons. The Clintons did it through their foundation, through the speaking fees. They got away with it. And the Bidens saw that and said, hey, we're going to start doing that. We're going to go global too. And there are other people I can guarantee you right now in Washington, D.C., unfortunately, from both political parties, they're sitting in Congress, they're sitting in the Senate saying, this is a way to cash in, and I'm not going to end up in jail.
Yeah, no, because I mean, the reality is, the Biden-China story has layers that go just beyond, simply the Bidens, right? For example, we've covered on this show how, Chinese entities are buying up massive amounts of American farmland, and even, single family homes. I have a feeling we wouldn't be allowed to do that in China. That wouldn't fly. But, talk about the impact of that, and can it actually be stopped?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's a huge problem, and I think it's an underreported problem. So, think about the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is supposed to track foreign ownership of our farmland. And what they will say is, well, about 1/3 of 1% of the farmland owned in the United States is owned by the Chinese. And how do they know that? Well, because if a Chinese businessman using a Chinese-based LLC buys a property, they're supposed to check in the box that they're buying this land. The problem is, and we know this in the state of Maine and in other states, what the Chinese do is they set up LLCs in Delaware, they set up LLCs in Canada, and they buy large portions of land in the United States. So it doesn't show up as Chinese owned. It shows up as Canadian owned or, American owned. So we don't even know the scale of the problem. So this is, I think, another area of transparency. I think we've got an incoming, hopefully, ag secretary that will be interested on these issues. We need to know what the problem is. The problem is much larger than it appears right now because of the way they're hiding it. So we need to get to the bottom of it. We need transparency, and we need to pass laws. There's nothing unreasonable about saying you cannot be a foreign national from a hostile country. I'm not talking about a Chinese American immigrant who came here. Correct. They don't like the CCP. I'm talking about a guy who still lives in mainland China, who's a member of the Chinese Communist Party, who's made all of his money with the help of the Chinese Communist Party, buying huge acreage in the United States. No, that should not be allowed. It's not good for America. The only people it benefits are the Chinese.
Yeah, and it's not just buying up the ag land. I mean, you could make a very strong case that in and of itself is dangerous, right? If you lose control of your food supply, we've given them control of, a big part of our, let's call it antibiotics production stuff. You have, a big part of our industrial, capabilities being there, all the batteries and rare earth minerals, that's all China, microchips, also China, but certainly Taiwan, and that's clearly at risk. But it also seems beyond that, so many of these things are strategically positioned near our military bases. They're not just buying this because it happens to be good, productive ag land. There's a more nefarious component to this as well.
Yeah, they want leverage. I mean, they want leverage, and they're looking for ways of leverage. And I mean, think of when COVID hit in 2020. President Trump was talking about China's involvement with, the pandemic and what happened. And what they tried to do, it didn't ultimately work. What they tried to do was say, well, maybe we're going to stop sending you guys penicillin. Maybe we're going to stop sending you guys antibiotics. So they look for mechanisms by which they can form leverage on American leaders. And that can be chips, that can be farmland, that can be food supply, that can be our dependence on foreign drugs. It's about leverage, leverage, leverage. And we're naive if we don't recognize that. So I've been very encouraged by what I've seen from, some of the committees in Washington have been doing a good job. I think certainly the incoming administration, Mike Walls, I think, understands these issues. Marco Rubio, the president, certainly does, the incoming president. So I think we're going to see action in this area. The challenge is it's like an octopus. There's so many different legs at work here. You've got to work on whittling them down individually, and that's just going to take time. So we got to be patient. But I think the mindset of the American people is now where this incoming administration is. And I expect that we're going to see some really, really good action on China. That's my hope. Of course, they're going to bring their lobbyists in. They're going to try to get Wall Street and corporate America to fight it. But I just think the center of gravity of this has shifted to this side. So on that ground, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, because it wasn't just even antibiotics. Didn't they turn around a ship, just that was like a PPE ship, like masks and gloves? Again, I was never a big believer in the mask. I'm saying, I don't know, if I can still smell someone's food, there's a chance this virus is probably also going through the ridiculous of the mask. But if they'll get that petty and sort of threaten these kinds of things in the midst of a global pandemic where people are actually dying, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot that they won't do to be able to exert that sort of leverage.
Right. And look at fentanyl. I mean, fentanyl is exactly the same thing. I mean, I talk about this in Blood Money, and we've talked about it on your program and others. It is a form of weaponization on the part of China. This is not kind of a random thing. We know that China is involved in every level of the production and distribution of fentanyl in the United States. The precursors, the pill presses, the chemists. There's 2,000 Chinese chemists working with the drug cartels in Mexico, putting this stuff together. The Chinese organized crime networks that are linked to the CCP are the ones that taught the Mexican drug cartels how to produce fentanyl. So it's a weapon. It's not a quote unquote drug problem in the way that heroin and cocaine is. It's a weaponized problem. And the good news is the incoming president-elect has talked about it as such and has said, we want this to stop, and you, China, have the ability and the means to stop it because we know you're in control of it. So part of the problem with a lot of these issues is just understanding what's going on and then being prepared to call out the Chinese for it. And whether that is masks or PPE supplies or threats over penicillin or fentanyl, it's acknowledging the fact that China is in control. This is a totalitarian state. So if there is widespread organized crime in China that is operating in China but gearing its activities towards the United States, it's going on, and the Chinese government is allowing it to go on. They could shut it down, but they choose not to. That's why it's being called out.
It's clearly, it's more than a psyop, right? It's designed to demoralize, a nation. You create, it's a sort of indiscriminate killer, goes after every demographic, every this, destroys families, destroys cities, destroys livelihoods, and frankly, boost China. I'm sure they're not doing this out of the kindness of their hearts with the Mexican drug cartels. It's full on warfare. At this point, isn't it?
Absolutely. They define it as warfare. And the thing is that it not only weakens the United States. Think about it. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for people under the age of 45 in the United States. And our media, by the way, kind of does us a disservice when they report on this, because usually what they say, Don, is, there were 100,000 fentanyl deaths last year. And the photos they show on TV are kind of the massive drug addicts that are kind of shaking or laying on the sidewalk. Yeah. That's not who's dying of fentanyl overdoses. The vast majority of people,
young kids at college taking, popping some sort of pill they think is going to have them, they're going to have a good time for a couple hours for the first time ever, and they're dropping dead. And, I think we all, I don't think there's a single person, watching that doesn't know someone directly, who's either died from it or, a close relative, of someone and love. So yeah, it's done this indiscriminately, and it could clearly be stopped. In China, they don't have a drug problem because if you actually get caught doing anything like that, they just kill you. I mean, it's that simple. I know my father's had that conversation. He talks about it, talking about with Xi. Is like, do you have a drug problem in China? No. Why? Because if we do a quick trial, what does that mean? They have a trial later that day, and they're put to death and never be heard from again, and hence no problem. But it doesn't stop them from sending it here.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. And yeah, the bottom line is that the vast majority of people dying of fentanyl in the United States, like you said, it's this college kid. They don't even know they're taking fentanyl. They weren't planning to take fentanyl. They thought they were, taking an Adderall because they're trying to study for an exam or something. So it's this massive weapon that kills young people, the sort of best and brightest in the United States, and they make money off of it, right? Because they are in league with the Mexican drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel works with these Chinese organized gangs that provide them the precursors, that provide them the pill presses from China to make these pills, that provide them with the chemists to create these. And by the way, they also help the Mexican drug cartels launder their profits through Chinese state-owned banks. So they're involved in every step of the level here. And the problem, of course, like with so many other things, is the Biden administration had no clue what was going on, or they did, and they looked the other way because Joe Biden kept saying, oh, this is just a drug addiction problem. It's not a drug addiction problem. It's a poisoning problem. And it's China that is poisoning Americans. And I think the new administration coming in, everybody that is around the president-elect, those decision makers and the president-elect himself understand what is going on. And I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, Xi's not going to do this just because he's a good guy. Xi's going to be forced to do this because the administration is going to exert the right leverage on them. And that's what I think is going to happen. And I think it's going to be pretty dramatic within the next 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you saw the story the other day, a Chinese national in jail for having 47,000 images of child pornography, pardoned or commuted, whatever, but same thing, essentially. Like, that has to be tied to this, right? You don't just commute the sentence of a pedophile or pardon a pedophile who happens to be a Chinese national if China doesn't want this guy out there, doesn't have something on you otherwise. I mean, do you think that all ties in? Because when I look at some of these pardons, and I'm like, why on earth would you do this? Unless, of course, someone has more stuff on you, has more leverage, and is ready, willing, and able to exert it on you.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And think about this. I mean, part of this, some of these pardons were supposedly linked to a prisoner swap, right? The Chinese, grab a legitimate American businessman, say he's a spy, and then we charge people in the United States, like this guy that was caught with all the child porn. And the Chinese want this guy back. He's obviously very valuable to them, and we're willing to trade them and swap them. You can't disentangle that from the deep ties we know that the Biden family has with the Chinese and runs in these circles. So it's another example of it. And it's another example of why, people say to me sometimes, Don, why do you always harp on corruption? There's so much corruption in Washington, D.C. We can't do anything about it. Yeah. First of all, it's not quite true. We have to do something about it. But number two, corruption has consequences, right? Yeah. This is not just that the Bidens got rich by selling to the Chinese. They did things in exchange for that money, things for the Chinese that hurt us. Yeah. So corruption is not a victimless crime. And this, I think, prisoner swap is another example of that. The willingness to kind of go along and send these horrible people back to freedom and probably celebration in China by commuting their sentences or pardoning them or whatever is ridiculous and is, just another blotch on this president and his administration.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of ultimately securing our border is also really securing the country from adversaries controlling us through their investments, right? That's the same with the land, everything. There's so many machinations of this, and your work really shows that perhaps more than ever. It seems to me that there's so much more, though, that we could do to actually hold these bad actors accountable rather than just giving them complete access to American markets with no strings attached. I understand, that bites both ways. But how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing we need to do is we need to have transparency, right? So like if a Russian oligarch or a Chinese CCP official is buying commercial real estate in New York or Los Angeles or wherever, they need to be transparent. They shouldn't be able to set up an LLC in Delaware under some lawyer's name. We need to know who the ultimate ownership is. So you got to begin with transparency, and you got to be vigorous about enforcing it. You mentioned earlier about the FARA violations with the Bidens. That law exists. It just doesn't get enforced, or it gets enforced against certain Republicans, but it does not get enforced against Democrats, right? Yeah. So they'll go after some Republican lobbyists, but they will not go after the Biden family. You've got to enforce the laws, but it begins with transparency. That's where we need to start. Then the second thing is, I think we have to look for an equivalence. This is kind of related to the tariffs debate, right? I mean, I think that the incoming president, your dad, probably says, hey, if we don't need tariffs, that would be great. But we only don't need tariffs if you guys aren't putting tariffs on American goods and preventing our access from your market. Yeah. So I think it needs to be the same. If we're going to allow Chinese CCP officials to invest in the United States, it needs to be transparent. And by the way, American investors should be able to invest in an equal way in Chinese real estate, which they can't do right now, by the way. And until that happens,
like, I don't think there's ever been a foreign national who's ever invested in China, got in a lawsuit with someone who's Chinese and or the government and actually won, right? I mean, it's just very different, right? And then, they talk, free trade, they run around like, I've been to China a couple of times. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a Ford or a Chevy in China. Like, there's no free trade. It's all pretend, right? You just can't even get these things there, and they're going to make sure of it. So, and now, at the World Economic Forum and at the UN, they'll scream to holy hell about American abuses, but like the reality, there is no free trade. That's a myth and a misnomer. They just pretend that we have it with them.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's, I think, another really healthy thing that's happening in the country. The American people are aware of that. They realize that sort of the official line on these issues, because the official line has been China doesn't really have a lot of tariffs. Well, they don't call them tariffs. Yeah, but they have all these kinds of
anything American there. Congratulations. It's not a tariff. It's never going to happen.
Right. You call it something else and it's not a tariff. I mean, that's ridiculous. So and the American people are waking up to that. And I think a lot of that has been, there have been consistent voices like the incoming president and others who have said, look, this is what's going on. And it's forced there to be reluctantly the media to kind of say, okay, well, maybe there are things the Chinese can start doing. So that has kind of shifted. Look, there's going to be a huge blowback. We know this. When the new administration comes in and starts trying to address these issues, the first thing they're going to do, they did the same thing in 2017, by the way, in the previous Trump administration, when they had come in and said, we're going to start looking at tariffs and restrictions on Chinese conduct in the United States because they restrict what we do in China. China didn't go to the White House. They went to Wall Street and they went to big tech and they went to Hollywood and said, guess what? You want access to our market? You want to keep making money in our country under our terms? You need to go to Washington and you need to go lobby Congress and Washington. They're going to do the same thing. But I think this time there's been a lot of lessons learned from the last administration. Part of that is who you select around you, right? And you've got people that are loyal, that share your mission. I think there's going to be a huge pushback, but I'm very optimistic that things are going to go even better this time than they did the first time in terms of this hand-to-hand combat, diplomatic combat that we're engaged in with China.
Yeah, I mean, you're discussing missions. What is your next mission, Peter? Are you still focused on China? What are the other sort of big stories that you want to uncover? What questions are you sort of eager to answer next?
Yeah, so corruption is a huge part of it. I think one of the problems we have, the size and growth in Washington, things just getting out of control with spending, is not just because liberals love big government. It's because a lot of people find big government profitable. Yeah. So we're going to continue to explore that stuff. I'm doing a lot of work on the immigration issue and looking at the corruption and the cronyism involved there. I think when we think of immigration, people oftentimes think of it in terms of, well, it's just a function of, poor people don't want to live in their country. They want to come here. That's part of it, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So I'm going to be delving into that issue, and I'm hopeful that that's going to be useful in the next administration in sort of uncovering who some of these people are, what their motives are, and what they're actually doing in the United States, and why they try to enable this mass illegal migration.
Yeah. Well, Peter, thank you so much. Thanks for everything that you do, guys. Make sure to check out Peter's books. Also, check out the Drill Down podcast so you can, keep up with these details. I think, as the mainstream media sort of continues to, just embarrass themselves, I think it's creating a great opening for guys like yourself and even myself to actually make sure that people understand what's going on. And I think with that transparency, we can actually effectuate real change, Peter. So thanks for all you're doing there.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Likewise, man. Be well.
Thanks. You too.